record on. So there we go. Yeah, over to you, Abby.
Okay, so I've not been very organised this morning, so I haven't given any readings out. So if people can be ready to volunteer as we go through, that'd be really helpful. And we're starting in chapter 5 of 2 Samuel. I know Carol did very briefly the first 5 verses, so we're gonna start by going over those, and we'll move on to the rest of the chapter. So could I volunteer to read 2 Samuel chapter 5 verses 1 to 5, please?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks, Michelle.
David becomes king over Israel. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You shall shepherd my people Israel, and you shall become their ruler.' When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years.
Lovely, thank you. There's a few different places that pop up in the readings today. So I'm just going to I've stuck them on a map. So if you just bear with me a second, and I just pop up. So that's a map of Israel, if you can see that. And we're starting off down here in Hebron. So I'll pop this up from time to time as we move around various places to see sort of an idea of where we're going to. So you can see here, Hebron's just there, west of the Dead Sea. Not good with geography. Okay. So David is approached by, I'm assuming, representatives of the tribes of Israel. So all the tribes of Israel came, but I think it's probably representatives. So that's a lot of people all showing up, isn't it? While Saul and possibly even Ishbosheth were alive, who would these tribes have sided with? Who would they have been loyal to?
Saul.
Yeah, Saul. He was king over Israel, so logically the tribes of Israel would have been loyal to Saul. So why have they come to David at Hebron in verse 3? What's the reason they've come to him?
To make David king.
Yeah, they want to make David king. Now, so far in 2 Samuel, several other people have tried to swap sides to David, as it were. Some successfully. I mean, Abner seemed to take the right approach and David welcomed him, but others rather less successfully. Can you think of some examples of people who tried to sort of please David and how they misjudged his response?
There was the guy that came and said that he had killed Saul.
And how was he rewarded?
Yeah, thinking, well, yes, he was killed. He thought he was doing the right thing, didn't he? Or he didn't even kill Saul either.
No, just trying to take credit for it.
To make it even worse. But yeah, so as a result, he was killed for that.
Yeah, brilliant. And last week we saw as well.
Abner.
Yes, Joab killed Abner, but Joab was already on David's side, wasn't he? He was leader of the army, so he wasn't necessarily trying to swap sides. He's a personal vendetta based on Abner murdering his brother.
2 people who killed Ishbosheth.
Yes, but Barnar and the other one, yes. Not very memorable names, but they definitely did have the same problem as the Amalekite, didn't they? They thought that by slaying Saul's enemy, they could then swap sides, and sorry, by slaying David's enemy, they could swap sides to David and he'd welcome them with open arms. So in contrast, what approach do the elders of Israel take today?
All the tribes are united and wanting to anoint David their king.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. They're all united, all come together, and they've come to approach him rather than bringing the head of an enemy or other tale of destruction. And what do they base their plea on? So they have a little spiel, don't they, in verses 1 and 2.
Because the Lord has said, you shall shepherd my people Israel, and you shall become their ruler.
Yeah, absolutely. They recognise that he's God's anointed and appointed ruler, and they appeal to David's responsibility as their king. Yeah, absolutely.
They're his flesh and blood.
Yeah, how are they his flesh and blood?
The same tribe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, all of the tribes of Israel are descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they are quite literally family, aren't they? Albeit at this point rather distantly related. So yeah, they appeal on the grounds of sort of family responsibility as well there. And there's something else as well in verse 2.
David led all their military campaigns, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, back when David was in favour with Saul, he was the leader of the army. He was the one that led them out against the Philistines. Saul quite often stayed back home, and David got all the accolades. These would have been the guys who were singing, you know, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. They was, you know, dead keen on them at one point until it all went a bit wrong. So it's possibly also noticeable what they don't say. What don't they appeal to David on the basis of? That's quite vague, isn't it? But I'm thinking compared to the Amalekite and Barna last week.
They don't do it through physical action in the same way, you know, try and take retribution. They're doing it through words and sort of almost like peace talks.
Yes, yeah, much more peaceful, appealing to David's very things you mentioned already. But also there's no criticism of Saul or his reign or his family, is there? There's no, you know, we didn't really like Saul anyway, or, you know, you're the anointed, you know, Saul deserved to die, or anything like that. It seems with David's actions over the past, well, it must be 7 years since what happened back in chapter 1. They've realised that David isn't about, you know, hating his enemy and wanting to get retribution for what has happened. They definitely seem to have perhaps learnt the lesson that others have paid on their behalf. Okay, so David is crowned king, not just over Judah this time, but over the whole of Israel. It's kind of hard to imagine when you sort of read all the stuff in 1 Samuel, but by the time he gets to being anointed in Hebron, king of Judah, he was only 30. It's nothing, is it? Well, when I was 20, I thought 30 was really old, but you know what I mean. Okay, so we're going to move on to verses 6 to 16. And can I volunteer to read those? There are some dodgy names towards the end, just make the best of it, please.
I'll have a go if you like.
Thanks, Julie.
Funny, I looked at it this morning. I was reading it out to Summer, so I've had a look at them in advance.
You practice, well done.
David conquers Jerusalem. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought, "David cannot get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies." That is why they say the blind and lame will not enter the place. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David, along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him there: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet.
And a round of applause for Julie. Well done.
Yeah.
Well done.
Thanks very much, Julie. Okay, I'm just going to pop back to the map because at this point he marches on Jerusalem. So just to show you where that is in comparison to Hebron, it's a wee bit. So it's about 15 miles sort of to the southwest down here. Okay, sorry. So we start in Hebron. He's going up to Jerusalem, 15 miles northeast. I told you, Jock was not responsive. Okay. So, who's living in Jerusalem?
Jebusites.
The Jebusites. Yeah, who are the Jebusites?
That's what I was going to ask you.
Ah, interesting. You should ask, Anne. I've got a few verses here back in the Old Testament. So, if someone can look up, I've got 3 here. So I'll get you to look them all up, and then we'll read them one at a time. So I'm going to volunteer to look up Exodus 3:17. Thank you, Tammy. Deuteronomy 20:17. Thank you, Verena. And Judges 1:20-21. Thank you, Jackie. Okay, so we'll start with, is it Tammy, doing chapter Exodus 3, verse 17. You're muted, and it's like you're having problems with your electronic Bible. Can we have someone with a physical Bible or a to do Exodus 3:17?
I'm there now.
They just stuck together.
And I have promised to bring you out of your misery in Egypt and the lands of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey.
Okay, so the Jebusites appear to be one of the inhabitants of Canaan before Israel even left Egypt. And quite often they're named in this group of 7 tribes or groups of people who were living in Canaan at that time. Verena, have you got Deuteronomy 20:17?
Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you.
Okay, so they're also in the group of people that were the Israelites were commanded to destroy when they went in there. Remember, the land of Canaan was inhabited by a very wicked race of people who did things like child sacrifice and all terrible things. And God was very clear that when he gave them the land, he wanted them to destroy the people who lived there before so that his people weren't contaminated or tempted away by the idol worshipping and the wicked practices of the people living there before. But in Judges 1, I've forgotten who I got. Jackie.
Yeah. Oh, was it Judges 20?
No, it's Judges 1, 20,
Oh, sorry.
21, I think.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. Verse 21, was it?
20 and 21, please.
Right. As Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who drove it from it 3 sons of Anak. The Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites, who were living in Jerusalem to this day. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. Benjaminites.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Jackie. Okay, so having had those 3 verses, who can summarize for me who the Jebusites were?
They're one of the groups that occupied the land of Canaan.
Absolutely. And why are they still there?
They hadn't been driven out.
Yes, exactly. They haven't been driven out. Why do we think that even at this point in history, sort of many judges later and 2 kings later, why do we still have the Jebusites living in Jerusalem? Jerusalem's old name was Jebus, so the Jebusites were inhabitants of Jebus.
Are they quite strong? I don't know.
Yeah, are they quite strong, or perhaps their fortress, their stronghold, I think perhaps is quite strong? It seems that they probably inhabited quite a large area of Canaan before the Israelite conquest. And now there just seems to be this very sort of small stronghold within Jerusalem city itself, where this sort of foreign group are sort of kind of an enclave, if you like, amongst all the Israelites area. Yeah, so perhaps it was they had a stronghold. Perhaps it was just too difficult to get rid of them. Perhaps they'd formed an alliance. Perhaps after they've been living there a long time, the Israelites sort of were accepting of the people living there. But God had instructed his people to take possession of the land and the people living there. Like, as I was reading it, sort of thinking about it, it kind of reminded me of sin a bit. You know, we know what God has commanded us to do, and sometimes a sin can be a bit too hard to get rid of, and after a while you kind of become comfortable with it and forget that really you shouldn't be doing it. And it's, perhaps I'm stretching a bit far, but it kind of had that comparison in my mind. So back to the chapter. Later on, we haven't read this yet, but when we do verse 17 onwards, we actually find David seeking God's will about whether or not to go down to fight against the Philistines. But he doesn't do that here. Anyone got any suggestions why that might be?
I don't know. It's just a guess. Could it be because he knew that God had already commanded that these people should be turfed out?
I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely. Although the command wasn't given directly to him, it was given to his people quite a long time ago. It was something that had never been done. It was a command of God that had not yet been obeyed, if you like. I think perhaps sometimes we can be like that when we've got things to do. You know, are we sitting here waiting for a sign from God, or actually is his will being made perfectly clear because he's told us what's right and what's wrong? And I think in this situation, David knew that this was a command of God and he had to obey it. Okay, but what's the Jebusites' attitude?
You won't get in here. Even the lame and the blind can defend this city.
Absolutely. They're not exactly quaking with fear, are they?
No.
They're pretty certain that, you know, even if they only had the weakest people defending the city, they'd still be perfectly okay. Obviously had a lot of faith in the stronghold and the defences of the city. I wonder if perhaps previous attempts had been made and failed, or perhaps the fortress was considered so impenetrable that no one even bothered trying. So obviously a battle commences. What description do we get of the battle?
Not very much.
Virtually nothing. No gory details, is there? It's very.
I love that word, nevertheless.
Yeah, precisely. Adamant they can't be conquered, but nevertheless, they recaptured the fortress of Zion, the city of David. Yeah, you do wonder how it happened, really. The look on the Jebusites' faces when they realised that all was lost. So there's a very brief description of the battle. They win. The Jebusites' comment about the disabled is rather thrown back at them and becomes a saying that perhaps the one-day quality groups would balk at. Other splendid victory have on the neighbouring king of Tyre.
We sent along cedar, the king of Tyre to David sent along cedar logs, carpenters and stonemasons to help him. So he was obviously pleased, wasn't he? So
yeah, I wonder what his motivation was for doing that.
Didn't want to be attacked by them.
I wonder if it was a sort of peace envoy. When that sort of setting in ancient Israel, there was a lot of sort of people fighting against each other, but clearly the king of Tyre had recognised that David was not someone he wanted to mess with, so he probably set about building a palace, so he'd have no excuse to turn on him next. Although we have no idea that David had any such idea. But so yes, David is becoming more and more powerful in terms of conquering peoples who perhaps were thought to be unconquerable, in terms of forging alliances with neighbouring kingdoms. And then we get this perhaps slightly awkward bit at the end here, where he discusses the taking of more concubines and wives. I think probably the listing of the children is another example of how he's being strengthened, not just on the battlefield, but also as a man. Having lots of children was seen as it were a sign of strength. It's difficult, isn't it? There's a lot of polygyny in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. I couldn't find any particular laws in the Old Testament against it, although obviously as you come into the New Testament, there's a lot more encouragement to just take the one wife rather than several. And God's example has always been one man and one wife in terms of Adam and Eve in the garden. And also God's example himself, he talked about the bit of the church being the bride of Christ, rather than his many wives and many brides, the church itself, rather than individual people being all his brides. I think it can be a bit awkward, doesn't it? But a bit of a stumbling block, I think, for people in this culture where polygyny particularly, but also polygamy is seen as a bit of an issue. Anyone got any thoughts on that? Interesting, you never get polyandry, which is the opposite of polygyny. The women never seem to have hundreds of husbands, do they?
That's because the men wanted the children apart from anything else, wasn't it? It was kind of, it does seem to have been a sort of status symbol, doesn't it, in many ways? I mean, the other thing is, and it's only a sort of side issue, I think, but often where the men did have more than one wife, it resulted in awful trouble between the various offspring in any case, didn't it? And I mean, that's certainly true in David's life. So, yeah. So is God subtly saying, hey, this isn't a very good idea? I don't know.
Yeah. The issues in Solomon had foreign wives who led him away from the true God. We have, like you say, problems between the children, not getting on from different wives, issues between the wives themselves. Think of Samuel's mother, Hannah, and the he had with Penina, I'm going to say. Strife there. Okay, so we're going to move now to the final section, verses 17 to 25. So can I have a volunteer to read that last bit there for me?
I'll read it if you like.
Thank you, Leslie.
And it's called David Defeats the Philistines. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him, but David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you defeat them into my hands? The Lord answered him, go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands. So David went to Baal-perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, as waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. So that place was called Baal-perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. Once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army. So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer.
Lovely, thank you, Leslie. Okay, so David, over the course of his life, had quite a conflicting relationship with the Philistines. What famous battle did, or what famous victory did David have at the very beginning of sort of the story we hear of him? Do you remember that?
Over Goliath.
David and Goliath, yes, the sort of Sunday school staple, isn't it? The Philistines are the baddies, and David wins over them. Also, do you remember what the cost of his first wife was? What he had to pay for her?
With so many foreskins, wasn't it, the Philistines?
Yes, 100 Philistine foreskins. So not only is he killing them, he's also circumcising them as well. So yeah, it's made him rather unpopular. But then remarkably, when Saul turns against him, he ends up actually living amongst the Philistines, and we went to live in Ziklag for over a year. And the Philistine there, he would go and raid various people and then come back and give stuff to the Ashkish, the king of the Philistines at the time. So, but the Philistines are the sort of sworn enemies, aren't they, of the Israelites? You know, any battle, you can generally assume the Philistines are the baddies. And this is what happened here. Now David is king over Israel. He is now the sworn enemy, essentially, of the Philistines. So they turn up in the Valley of Rephaim. So back to my trusty map. Bear with me a second. So not far from Jerusalem, just slightly to the north there, there's a little river that runs down the side there. And they've come, says they came to search for him, which is a really strange thing to do because it wasn't like he was hiding. So I do wonder why that phrase is used there. But the Philistines come out to look for David. And David hears about this and went down to the stronghold, possibly Jerusalem or possibly a stronghold in this particular valley. They spread out across the valley. And what's David's response? Does he whip an army and dive down? He seeks the Lord's face and asks him what he should do, inquires of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? And the Lord's response,
go.
Yes, and I will hand them over to you.
Yeah. So David, in obedience to the Lord, goes down and fights against the Philistines. Who wins?
The Lord. David.
Oh. Very good, Jackie. Who else wins? So it's David and the Israelites have the victory. But as Jackie said, the Lord wins. And there's kind of a symbolic idea here as well, because not only does David and the Israelites win the battle and defeat them, but the Philistines abandoned their idols. The kind of symbolic idea that not only was it a victory for the men, but there was the King of Kings, the God, the true God, has had victory over the false gods, and all their idols have been left on the battlefield, and David takes them back. And I hope he melts them down or does something else with them rather than puts them somewhere safe. But the Philistines aren't put off. They've been quite a formidable foe for many years, so one little battle isn't going to scare them away. And they come up and they spread out again in the Valley of Rephaim. So, what does David do?
Inquire of the Lord.
He inquires of the Lord. Yes, he's obviously got quite a good handle on being king, and obviously a lot of practice on relying on God when he was running from Saul as well. So, yeah, he knows the right thing to do. I find it interesting. Am I wrong in thinking that Saul, whenever he inquired of the Lord, he got Samuel to do it for him? I have to look into that. I wonder, but David seems to inquire himself. I wonder if that sort of speaks of a closer relationship of David to God. Let's look at homework for you. Look, report back next week. So yes, the Philistines come up. David inquires of the Lord, but what did the Lord say this time?
Don't go straight up, but circle around the in front of the poplar trees.
Yeah. So he gives some battle advice and says, don't do it this way, do it a different way. And kind of reminded me of Moses, when he struck the rock. And when he did it the first time, as instructed by God, the water came out. But the second time, was he told to speak to the rock or something else? But he wanted to do it his way, the same way it worked last time. So he conked on the rock and was told off for it. Whereas David, he inquires of the Lord, he gets the answer and he obeys it. He doesn't think, well, I did it this way last time, I'll do it the same way again. And he does, says 25, David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. I should have put those on the map as well, but I'm afraid I haven't done. So we can see here that, David has established his throne. God, the Lord, has established David's throne over Israel. He's given him victory over the Jebusites, who were perhaps thought to be unconquerable because of the stronghold they had in Jerusalem. And then also over the Philistines, which again is quite symbolic because they've been for a long time Israel's sort of long-standing enemy. So it's a really good start to David's reign. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. So if I just close briefly in prayer, I'm quite aware of the funeral we want to attend, so I don't want to go on too long. So let's just pray to God, shall we? Our Heavenly Father, we just thank you for your faithfulness to David. Help us to know you are the same God today, and we can rely on you. Help us to seek your face in all that we do and not trust on our own strength. Help us to know your will. Amen.
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 Oh, thank you, Abby, for that. I will
Yeah,
send the
thank you.